What's up, Inside Out? How are y'all doing? Yes. Hey, it is great to be with you. My name is Jeremy. I'm a small group leader here with the senior guys. See some of you guys sitting down front here. There we go. I'm excited to be here for this series, I Have Questions. I love this topic because we all have questions about faith and God and Christianity, and I think it's so relevant to all of us in this room. And so throughout this series, we've been essentially taking a question and spending 1 week on it and unpacking an idea about a question. And to get us into our topic today, I want to tell you a little bit about somebody who is very important to me, and that is my brother, Jamie. This is my brother, Jamie, and this was us. We're both the same height, solid 5'5", so in case you're wondering. But this is my brother, and this was us at my wedding. He was my best man at my wedding, and he's a great friend of mine today. We have a great relationship. I love my brother a whole lot, but growing up for us, we didn't really have a great relationship. And I don't mean that in like we didn't get along. We were just more of like acquaintances because my brother is 4 years older than me, and we're actually just very different people as a whole. About the only thing that we have in common is our love for Harry Potter. We love Harry Potter, books, movies, all of it. In fact, we have matching Harry Potter tattoos, and that's kind of a story for another time, but that's true, and so there you go. You can do with that what you will. But I want to show you a little bit about my brother. In fact, growing up, he had more of like a skater vibe to him. This was him growing up, and I don't think he even knows I'm like showing these pictures, so sorry, Jamie. But this is him growing up. He had more of a skater vibe. He had like the big shoes, baggy jeans, all of that stuff. And I definitely went with like more of a jock feel. This was me growing up, much more of like a jock kid, right? No, I was definitely like a big time nerd. I still am today. But we had different styles growing up. Not only that, but we played different types of sports. My brother was into normal sports. He played baseball. This is him playing baseball when he was young. That's him playing baseball. And he played hockey, played football, a bunch of those types of things. And I did like no sports with balls whatsoever. I did sports like taekwondo and gymnastics, and that's me when I was a yellow belt in taekwondo. And so we were different in our the things we liked to do, extracurricular activities, all that stuff as well. And then we both went to high school, both went to Vista Ridge. Any Rangers in here? Yep. My brother was actually the first graduating class at Vista, so random fact of the day for you. But from there, my brother went on to college, and unfortunately for him, he chose to go to Texas A&M University, unfortunately for him. I was a much smarter person, and I chose to go to the University of Texas instead. Yes. So we were a bit of a divided family, you could say. But one of the most different things about my brother and I today is probably our career choices. My brother is really smart. When he went to A&M, he got his degree in molecular cell biology and neuroscience. So yeah, it's a mouthful to even say it. He's a really smart guy. And then I got my degree in radio, television, and film, so everything related to media. And I actually decided to come on staff here at North Point right out of college. And so I work here at a church, and my brother is like full on in the science field. Like he is a scientist. He deals with like DNA and all that cool stuff. And I'm essentially like a professional Christian. And so for us, it's one of the most different things about us. And the reason I share that is because I think in our life and our culture, there's kind of this debate between science and faith, or science versus faith. Like these things come at odds against one another. And the reason I shared all that stuff about my brother and I is that we believe different things and we do different things for a living, but we actually have a fantastic relationship and we love getting to hang out with one another. And I think that the same can be true of these two topics. I think that science versus faith can actually be science and faith. That these two things that bump heads, that are very different from a cultural standpoint, perhaps aren't so different after all. But the reason that I think that we believe this assumption is because in culture, there's kind of this stigma, like, oh, if you're a Christian, then just like leave your brain at the door. Like, the Christians are the feelers and the science people are like more the logical oriented thinking people. Or somebody might say, I believe and I trust science, so I guess that means I don't believe in God, or I don't have any faith, or I'm not a Christian. And this is kind of our assumption in culture. And so today, with that being said, the question that I want to tackle is one that I think is relevant for each of you in this room and relevant to culture as a whole. And that question is, can science and faith exist together? Can these two seemingly opposite things actually coincide? Can they coexist together? As it is with many of these big questions that we're tackling, there is actually an assumption underneath this question. And in this case, the assumption is this: is science explains everything, so we don't need God. Science explains everything, so we don't need God. That's the assumption behind this. And this probably isn't a surprise to you because I'm standing up here talking and you already know what I do for a living and all of that, but I believe this assumption to be incorrect. And for the rest of our time, I want to build the case as to why I think that this assumption is false. And I want to give you a heads up because I know that you are all really smart in here, and I know that you probably don't want a childhood answer to a big adult question like this. Today is going to be a little bit more of an intellectual message, and I want to let you know about that ahead of time. But at the end of our time, I'm going to pose a question to each person in this room, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. And it's a question that maybe you've answered or maybe you haven't answered before, but it's a question that I'm going to challenge each of you in this room with, and it's a very important one. I think it's one of the most important questions you can answer in your entire life. But the first reason why I think that this assumption is false is because when you actually go to scientists, people who are experts in the field of science, and you ask them what they believe about God, the statistics that you discover are actually pretty surprising. In fact, 7% of scientists say they just don't know. They would say, I don't know, I don't really have a conclusion based on what I have discovered in science. Not only that, when you kind of take it a step further, what you discover is that 51% of scientists, all scientists, believe in some form of deity or high power. 51% believe they have some kind of faith in something that they can't see. So when you take that 7% and you add it to 51, 58%, it leaves a 42% of people, scientists, who don't believe in God. Which is pretty crazy because so often we make the assumption that, if you trust science, then you can't believe in God, when actually the majority of scientists, go to the next slide, the majority of scientists are not atheists. And let that sink in for a second. The majority of scientists are not atheists. And so why do we have this assumption? Why do we have this assumption that this science and faith thing are actually at odds? Well, when you look at the definition of science, it's really helpful. Science is this, and it's a little bit wordy, so hang with me. Science is a systematic enterprise. It's a way of thinking that builds and organizes knowledge. It adds to our understanding in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. So an easier way to kind of sum all that up is that science essentially asks the question, how? How? It looks at something in the universe, and it says, how does that thing work? I see that it exists. How does that work? How does that make sense? That's what science sets out to do. And the absolutely incredible thing is that science does an exceptional job at answering how in so many areas. It's why we know so much about what we know today about the universe we live in. It's why we know so much about the elements that make up everything. Why we know so much about the human body. It's why we know so much about the solar system and the universe and the stars and the planets and everything around us. It's why we know so much about the ecological systems that govern our world. Science has answered this question, how, time and time and time again. And it's taught us so much about the universe that we live in. And it's amazing. But, for some reason, as we have answered the question how in so many areas, we have taken the answers to this question and applied it to a completely different set of questions. Because as we have answered how, we have then taken the answers of how the universe works and how we discover it around us and applied those same answers to the questions of why and who. Why does it work that way? What's the meaning behind it? And who? Who caused it to work that way? Is there a who behind all of it? Think about it like this. If I look at my arm and I say, I know how all the cells work in my arm. it would then be kind of silly of me to say, therefore, because I know how it works, nobody then created my arm because I understand how it works. The same can be true if you look at the solar system and the planets. Just because we discover how they orbit around the sun through general relativity doesn't mean that nobody caused it to be that way. One of the best examples I've heard about this analogy is this. Take my iPhone, for instance. It's an iPhone 10. Hopefully it's an iPhone 11 soon, but it's an iPhone 10 for now. But we each have one of these in our pockets, and what's amazing is that this apparently has more computing power than the computers that landed us on the moon. And if I kind of went into the engineering field and I said, hey, I'm going to discover everything about how this works, the hardware, the software, all the engineering behind it, if I got to the point where I understood everything about how this works, it would still be silly of me to say that just because I understand how it works, therefore nobody created or caused it to work that way. That would be an incorrect conclusion. But that's what we do a lot of the times with these questions. In fact, if I understood how this works, I would probably be more inclined to think that somebody created it to work the way that it does. We can't take the answers of how the universe works and apply it to why or who potentially caused it to work that way. So back to our definition of science, this wordy definition. I want to hone in on one word here that's really important, and it's this. It's explanations. Because science sets out to explain how something works. And here's where I think faith and science kind of bump heads, is because of this. Is because faith doesn't explain everything. Faith doesn't explain everything. I'm not naive. I know that's true. Faith is called faith for a reason. When you take the Bible, for instance, you open up the Bible and you read Genesis, the creation of the world. Notice that it says that God created the universe. It never says how he did it. Faith doesn't deal with that set of questions in that particular topic. Science deals with how. Faith doesn't try to tackle how in that way. So, faith doesn't explain everything. Not only that, but neither does science. Science tackles how, not why or who. And when you ask scientists this, if you showed a scientist this statement, they would most likely agree with you. Why? Well, because at both the macro and micro level, there is mystery. At the macro level, when you look at the whole universe and you think about the Big Bang and dark energy and dark matter and black holes and cosmic radiation and all of these big topics that we're beginning to understand things about, there's so much mystery left that we don't yet understand. And then you look at the micro level and you think about molecules and atoms and quantum mechanics and all of this stuff. There's so much mystery there as well. There's so much mystery left with things that we don't yet understand. And so we're left with a question. And that question is, who is behind the mystery? Just because we understand how it works, who is behind the mystery? It's crazy to think about how far we might go in science in the next 50 years based on how much we've discovered in the last 50 years. But most scientists would say, even with that, most scientists would say that they don't think we're ever going to fully understand everything about how the universe works. There is mystery, which begs the question, who is behind the mystery? And so in conclusion, to our original question that we asked, can science and faith, go to the next slide, can science and faith exist together? Yes, I think that they can. Most scientists would agree based on the fact that they actually have a belief in some higher form or higher power or deity in their life. Science sets out to answer how, not why or who is behind the universe. Not only that, but there's a lot to be explained. There is a lot to be discovered. And one of my favorite quotes about this is from a guy named Alan Sandage. He's an astronomer, and he says it like this. He says, "It is my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science." So where does that leave us? If we do agree that science and faith, these two things can exist together, where does that leave us? Well, like I said, it leaves us with a bigger and deeper question then as a result. And it's a question that I think most of us or most people don't fully try to answer in their life. And the question is this: does God exist? Does God exist? Is there a who behind the mystery of the universe? I think most people choose not to answer this question. And the reason I say that is because we go through life and we have doubts and we have questions, and subconsciously we might or might not say yes or no, or I think so at any given time. But if we were to definitively say yes or no, the implications in our life then are very uncomfortable if we answer this question. There's a guy who lived a couple hundred years ago, and his name is Blaise Pascal. He's a mathematician, physicist, and philosopher. So think about that. He's a pretty smart dude. And he actually tackles this question in a very helpful way, and I want to show you what he says. He says it like this. He says, God is or is not. In other words, either God exists or he doesn't. There's not a lot of in-between here. And then he goes on to describe how we live our life in such a way that we essentially make a wager on what we think about the existence of God. We either wager that he does exist or he doesn't. And we live our life in this way. And he says that the true course is to not wager at all. And this is why I think most people choose not to answer that question. The true course is to not wager at all, to say, I kind of want to live my life the way I want to live it. The implications of yes or no, I'm going to choose not to answer that because I don't want to go there. And so he says the true course is to not wager at all because of those implications. And he goes on, he says, if you gain all. In other words, if God does exist, if you gain all. Why? Because if God does exist, then that means that you were created by something bigger than you. There's meaning, there's purpose, there's value behind your life. And then he says in this wager, he says if you lose nothing. Because you're essentially left right where you started when you had doubts and questions in the first place. You lose nothing. So he says when we ask ourselves this question, wager then, without hesitation, that he is, that God does exist. Basically, he says, because it sounds way better that God exists, go ahead and live your life and wager it so that he does. Which any rational thinking person would go, okay, that's not a logical argument. That's just something that's like emotionally comfortable, right? And he knows this. And so he says, yes. He says, I get that, yes. But you must wager. You must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. You have to answer this question. You are embarked. You are living your life. Think about it this way. This analogy was helpful for me. Let's say one of my guys, let's say Shad, because he's looking at me. Let's say Shad comes to me and he's like, hey, Jeremy, hey, let's go to Colorado, dude. Like, I know you're from there. That sounds fun. Let's go to Colorado. And I'm like, dude, that sounds awesome. I got to check with my wife, Ashley, first. I got to ask her first if we can do this. That sounds fun, though. And then a couple months later, he comes to me again. He says, hey, you said you wanted to go. Are we going to go? Like, what's the deal? Are we going to go to Colorado or not? And I say, that sounds awesome, man. Like, plan the trip, invite everybody. Let's go. I got to figure it out first. I got to figure out if it works in my schedule. And this happens kind of over and over and over again. Eventually, Shad's going to show up on my doorstep, and he's going to be knocking. And he's going to say, dude, like, we're leaving today. Do you want to go or do you not want to go? And at this point, based on how I answer the question, I can either say, yes, I do want to go and I can go with him, or I can say, no, I don't want to go, I'm staying here. But the thing is that he is going to leave regardless. And so if I choose again to not answer the question, in choosing not to answer because he's leaving without me, I have chosen to say, no, I'm not going to go with you. And that's Blaise Pascal's point in this quote. He says that we live our life in such a way that we say yes or no to the existence of God. And when our time on earth is up, our life will have essentially answered the question for us. We are already embarked to answer yes or no, does God exist? So he finishes, he says, which will you choose then? God or no God? Which will you choose? A lot of scientists actually kind of come along this path and come up to this point to ask the question, who is behind the mystery? Like that guy that I just quoted, but so many others. In fact, Francis Collins, who is the guy who led the research project behind the human genome, we have him to thank for how we have discovered how the human body works. He describes his understanding of the Big Bang and God and the mystery like this. He says, the Big Bang cries out for divine explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. Essentially, his science led him to his faith, and he's a Christian. And then you have people who aren't Christians, who are faced with the same exact question and who say similar things. In fact, Stephen Hawking, who passed away not too long ago, said this before he passed away about the Big Bang. He said, if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 1,000,000 million millionths, which is like a number that we don't even know how to comprehend with our minds, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size into a hot fireball. He goes on. He says, next slide, the odds against the universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. And look at this. He says, I think there are religious implications. Science is not an answer to the question of whether or not you believe God exists, because those two things, science and faith, are not pitted against each other. So the question I challenge each of you with is God or no God? Which will you choose? And I realize this is a big question, and we're not going to keep going down this argument because we would be here all night. But there is a great resource that I want to give you all a heads up on that you can go to. If you actually go to the Instagram Inside Out page in the bio, you can find a link to a message that we did about a year ago that asked this exact question, does God exist? If you're there and you're like, hey, I want to learn more about this, then that's a great place to go. But to wrap up, I'll say this. If you're in here and you're not a Christian, I'm so glad that you're here tonight, and I just want you to know that I really do hope that Inside Out is the safest place for you to ask questions like this. And what my hope for you is that you would take whatever objections you have, whatever pushbacks, even against me, whatever disagreements with me, that's totally fine, and that you would take those things into a small group and just begin to ask those things. I'm not saying you need to make a decision today about what you believe about God or not, but I just want you to commit to the journey of answering that question for yourself, because I think it's that important of a question in your life. And then if you're in here and you are a Christian and you say, Jeremy, I've been with you the whole time, then here's my challenge to you. I would challenge you to discover more about why you believe the things that you believe in your life, because it is a beautiful process to do so. It's incredible to learn more about God. In fact, when you look at the Christ behind Christianity, even though Christianity is seen as more of an anti-intellectual religion, when you look at what Jesus said was the most important thing to followers of Jesus, what you see is this. He says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart. Many of you have probably seen this verse before. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, meaning, hey, feel all of those incredible things at Camp 75 and in the summer, and it's a movement, and that's incredible. And it's even better than that, because he goes on, he says, and with all your soul and with all of your mind. Because when you discover the reason behind the things that you believe, the reason for your faith grows as a result. You can love God by answering and asking questions about the doubts and the things that you want to discover about him, and it's an incredible process. I've experienced this in my own life. I took an astronomy class in college. We had to get a science credit, and I took an astronomy class. And it was cool. I went into it. I was already a Christian. I went into it, and I was kind of wondering, what is this going to be like? Am I going to be kind of the lone, it's UT. Am I going to be the lone Jesus follower in the room? But I learned so much in that class about stars and planets and the universe, and one of the things was popular astronomy topics. So there'd be like a new discovery, and then about black holes, and we'd literally talk about it in class. Like, it was one of my favorite classes in college. And I found myself kind of wondering how I would react to all of these things, because I had this assumption, science versus faith, But what I found myself thinking time and time again as I discovered these things, and I just thought, wow, like that is incredible. And I heard a pastor say during this time that when a new discovery comes out in science, Christians should be the first to say, wow, so that's how God did it. That is so cool. Wow, so that's how God created black holes, and that's how God designed all of those things to work? Like, that's amazing. And that should be our response. And so I found myself having this exact response. And then, coming out of college, I kind of kept this interest in astronomy. And so a couple weeks ago, I was in Rocky Mountain National Park with my wife, Ashley, and I made a goal this year because I'm a geek and I'm a nerd and I like this stuff. I made a goal to go someplace dark enough in the world, because there's light pollution everywhere around here, to go somewhere dark enough in the world where I could see the Milky Way just with my eyes. That was a goal of mine this year. And so we're there for the first night at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I had looked up the dark sky map. I knew the light pollution, the scale of what it was, and it was like kind of rare to see the Milky Way. It depends on the night and all that stuff, and then the sun goes down and stars start coming up over the mountains, and they begin to dot. And then about a couple hours in, I walk out of our tent, and I look up, and I just see this faint band across the sky. And I was so in awe in that moment. It was so cool to see that I grabbed Ashley and I said, hey, I want to try to take a picture of it because I'm a photographer. And so I was like, I want to try to take a picture of it. So I dragged her out to a field because I'm scared of mountain lions. And so I took my wife with me to protect me. And I dragged her out to this field, literally pitch black in the middle of the night. We're in a valley. There's mountains on both sides. You can't see anything around us. And I set my camera up, and I did a long exposure photo, so it took a photo for 30 seconds, so it allowed more light to come into the camera than my pupils can see on my own. And this is the photo I got. And it was so faint, but you guys can see this little stream of gas and stars and solar systems and planets that came across the sky. And I was so psyched. I literally stared at the picture for like an hour in the tent. Like I just looked at it. I was so excited. But then I went home and I Googled people who are actually really good at this and what their pictures look like. And I found this photo right here, literally almost in the same spot. And I thought, I should get better at this because I have a long ways to go. But then I also just thought, that's absolutely amazing. Like, that's incredible. It blows my mind that we're all sitting here right now, and we would go outside and we look up and we can't even see it, but all of that is like right there above our heads right now. And so for me, when I came out of my tent that night and I couldn't see it all super clearly like that, and I looked up, I literally just stood there and looked up like this. And when I looked up and I saw the stars, tears literally began to swell up in my eyes. Because I just thought, man, it's absolutely amazing that God created all of that, and a God that's big enough to create all of that created me, created you, and loves us. Like, that just blew my mind. It still does every single day, and it's why I'm such a nerd when it comes to this stuff. But for me, discovering more about it and loving God with my mind in this way has grown my faith. And that's my hope for each of you in here too, wherever you're at on the faith spectrum, that you would ask questions, that you discover more about science, and it would lead you to go, wow, so that's how God did it. That is absolutely amazing. And as a result, it would grow your faith. And so, does God exist? Does he not? I would just urge you to answer the question for yourself and allow your faith potentially to develop and grow as a result. Would you pray with me for our time? God, thanks so much for this incredible group of people. Thanks for just the fact that we get to have a place that we can come and talk about these types of questions, and we can ask things about you, things that ultimately grow our faith in the end. God, thank you for the stars and the planets and the galaxies and the solar systems that you created. It's like you created them just so we could look at them and be in awe of how beautiful you are and how much you love us. So we just thank you for that. God, would you help us discover more about you today? We pray this in your name. Amen.